Senator Chris Dodd, Congressman Barney Frank, thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
All right, let's just get into the mindset of back then, 10 years ago. When and where did it become clear to you that you were fighting the worst financial crisis in generations?
Well, I think it was like beginning of 06. I mean, when we talk about the crisis of 08, but really, contrary to what people think, this was not a secret, the housing bubble. And as early as 06, in fact, Jack Reed, Senator Reed of Rhode Island, and Jim Bunning, of all people, Bunning chaired the subcommittee dealing with housing, and they had hearings in 06 on the growing problem of the housing bubble. But it wasn't really until 07, into 07, and then it was Bear Stearns, which really kind of blew things up. But there was we had 90 hearings in the Senate in 07 on the housing crisis coming along. 90 hearings, a lot of hearings. So we were very much aware the problem was growing.
And you have years and years, Congressman, in dealing with housing issues. You were tracking this too, right?
Yeah, and Chris is right. We were on to the housing thing. In fact, in my first year as the chairman of the committee, 2007, when the Democrats took over, we actually passed a bill that would have shut down the bad housing, and it was Republican opposition meant you couldn't break a filibuster in the Senate. But actually, there's this conservative myth that the problem was that liberals were pushing to put poor people into housing, and that's what caused the problem. The exact opposite is the case. Beginning in '94, Congress passed a bill the last time the Democrats had control until back to 2007, which mandated the Federal Reserve to restrict that. Alan Greenspan refused to do it. Greenspan said, no, I believe in the market.
This is in the 1990s, right? He got the power
in
to
1994.
do this.
And then in the late 90s, a number of states began to do this because the federal government wasn't, and the Bush administration used the federal power of preemption and canceled the ability of the states to do it. So then, when the Democrats get control, there are hearings, as Chris mentioned, that he's holding. We actually passed a bill. The Republicans are still against it. The Wall Street Journal, now I love this, in November of 2007, the Wall Street Journal attacked me by name because we were trying to restrict subprime loans. And they said, why doesn't he want poor people and people and minorities to take over? So, but I will say this, I think we saw it as a housing issue. We didn't see how much it was going to spread. But then Chris is exactly right. When Bear Stearns had to be taken over, that was a sign that this had spread beyond housing.
And then in the fall, you get Lehman. But is there a meeting where Treasury comes over and says, no, this is happening now, it's starting to fall apart?
Well, during the summer, I would get phone calls on Friday afternoon from Paulson generally after the markets had closed, sort of, we got this problem. Remember, there was a problem where Citicorp was a problem, and then there was a problem where Wachovia was a problem, and they had Wachovia be taken over by Wells Fargo. And then there was Merrill Lynch, and that was taken over by Bank of America. There was a series of potential failures, and they found some way to resolve it, starting with Bear Stearns. But then came Lehman, and there was nobody left to resolve it with, and but we saw this building up.
Well, we did, but let's just say, I mean, the administration was slow. I mean, the idea that it was one ant in the kitchen, I mean, this is somehow that this was a one-off problem, and that it wasn't a systemic problem.
This is the late George W. Bush administration at that moment.
Yeah, he's very unpopular and leaving office, and so made it difficult. But that was, Hank and Paulson, look, he came out of Goldman Sachs, very knowledgeable, smart, not a Washington person. And so it was uncomfortable, I think, in many ways with the politics of the town, in a sense, and wanted to keep the ball in the air, be positive, and this was all going to work out in positive statements, when in fact it was going the opposite direction.
I had a somewhat different reaction to Paulson, and you're right to mention Bush. I mean, the problem is, I think Paulson did begin, and Bernanke, to see this, although Bernanke had earlier said, he acknowledged it, this is housing, it's not going to spill over. But I think they began to see that this could be more of a problem. Certainly they were telling me they were worried they didn't have the tools, but you had this very conservative administration. And by the way, when Bernanke and Paulson did intervene to keep Bear Stearns from failing and had J.P. Morgan Chase take it over, the Republicans on the committee that I chaired, very, very conservative, wanted me to have hearings so they could denounce Paulson and Bernanke. for their intervention. I wouldn't have the hearings. I didn't think that was going to be kind of
Who,
useful.
by the way, is working fairly fluidly with his president, with their president, who's a Republican, nonetheless.
But this was the tension that Paulson faced, which was, you know, the Republican Party was so resistant, and I do think they were, you know, they had a series of, well, we'll fix this, we'll fix that. Paulson and Bernanke were saying immediately, well, we would like to have a better set of tools, and I think in the end, though, you know, they had J.P. Morgan Chase take over one, and Bank of America took over another, and Wells Fargo took over another, and then came Lehman, and there was nobody left to take it over.
Did you have the right resume to have to deal with this? Did you have the right qualifications and expertise to do this kind of work?
Well, probably no one did, in the sense we were dealing with a set of issues and problems that hadn't surfaced. Obviously, the industry had become far more sophisticated, outstripped the capacity of the regulators in rulemaking. And I think, you know, Paulson's correct, and Bernanke, in the sense that the tool chest was not keeping pace with the kind of issues that we're confronting all the time. And the issue of financial literacy, I've often said, is not only a general problem with the public at large, but you can make the case for the Congress itself. And all of a sudden, dealing with issues, dealing in the derivatives area, for instance, which might as well have been in Latin or Greek as well as in English. So there was that gap. But there were talented people. As I mentioned, we had 90 some odd hearings in '07, not to mention '08, and a lot of very talented people coming up and warning about the problems, and they were being ridiculed. I remember one guy came up and said there could be as many as 1 million foreclosures, and he was accused of exaggerating, and he was. He was exaggerating in the sense of the size. It was more like 5 million.
It was more like 5 million.
Yeah,
Did you feel you were in over your head at any point in all this?
I felt I was being, I wouldn't feel I was being pushed. I mean, you mentioned my interest in housing. I got on this committee, it was then called the Banking Committee, because I cared about housing. And when I became chairman, I thought, well, gee, now I can really do something about affordable housing. And you know, by necessity, you had to deal with this. No, I had to do a lot of learning. You know, these things, derivative, were deliberately somewhat obfuscatory. And yeah, I almost felt like the teacher who's teaching a subject that's new, and you're a day ahead of the class. I mean, the night before you teach the class, you've got to go read the lesson, and there's a lot of learning there. And of course, you realize how much you pick up. Because my husband is a surfer, not somebody who had previously been involved in this, but somebody later told him he was the East Coast surfer most knowledgeable about credit default swaps that they'd ever met.
He did the crash course as well. So look, we're certainly going to be talking a lot about the legislation, Dodd-Frank, but back in the TARP days, in that fall of 2008 after Lehman, you're working hard on a response. But what's your biggest regret from that period? I know, for instance...
Well, for me, it's easy. We did put into the bill, and they just wanted the authority to go and do it. And they were worried, and I understand that, although I disagree with it. They were worried, particularly Paulson, that if the heads of the financial institutions were unhappy with the terms, they wouldn't participate. I told them at the time that was the most unpatriotic description of bankers I ever heard, that if we, for example, were to impinge on their bonuses, they would not do what was necessary to save the...
So unpatriotic.
Yeah, well,
national emergency, and they don't want to forego.
And we disregarded that and wrote into things that they didn't want. But we did write into it explicitly the authority to use some of the TARP money for foreclosures. And what happened was Paulson decided he needed to use the first 350. Well, here's the dilemma we had: Chris Dodd, myself, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid. You know, it's part of the problem of being a Democrat. We believe in government. We believe government has a major role, and we're not ready to see things crash because the people we most care about are going to be hurt. People said, oh, you just bailed out the bankers. Jamie Dimon wasn't going to be hurting. He didn't have to go to the ATM. He had enough money put away. It's the working people who were going to be hurt. And so we had to give them the tools, knowing that we couldn't wield them ourselves, but the alternative would have been worse. And one of the problems we had was we told him to do something about foreclosure, and he refused to do it, and that was my most serious regret.
Well, it was, you know, people have forgotten this, but we had the meeting on September 18th, which of course was that incredible gathering where Ben Bernanke says, and I'm quoting him almost exactly here, unless you act, speaking to the congressional leadership, Barney and I in the room, in the matter of days, the entire financial system of this country and a good part of the world will melt down. needless to say, the oxygen left the room in Nancy Pelosi's conference room that night. Within a matter of a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, at 1:30 in the morning, received a bill, and it was 2.5 pages long, said, give me $700 billion, no court, no regulator can intervene. I got the call at 6:30 in the morning from staff saying you can't imagine Barney and I trying to pass the thing. So began then the negotiations on a bill, which turned out to be about 100 pages long. But we did a number of things in there, and Barney's absolutely correct. They were not enthusiastic about it. In fairness to them, they were worried that the banks would not participate. But assistance on foreclosure, the warrants, which made us billions of dollars for the taxpayer ultimately.
In the end.
Yeah, but people don't remember that at all. Tranches, we didn't vote all at once. It was done in parts so you could actually judge it. Put a GAO resident in the process, a congressional committee of oversight along the way. And the point that Barney just made, I talked to Steve Ratner last night, had we not done what we did beyond the banks and allowed for some of those monies to be used in other economic areas, Chrysler and GM would have failed.
That's an interesting point. So this financier, famous Steve Ratner,
Yeah.
his point is that if you got the homeowners mortgage relief, it might have impinged on
Some
the
of that money could be
auto
used
rescue.
for other things, yeah. In
No,
fact,
he wasn't complaining about it.
No,
Chris just
quite the
mentioned that.
opposite.
We wrote it somewhat more broadly, and the way we wrote it was what allowed them to keep General Motors and Chrysler in business. That came out of the TARP.
Yeah, that's part of that. That was part of the negotiation of putting that package way beyond, give me 750.
Oh, I see. You're saying, look, you didn't have $2 trillion. You had $700 billion you were working with,
Right.
and it had to be allocated.
Yeah.
You tried on mortgages.
And Chris mentioned the tranches. So the first tranche, which is a fancy congressional word for half, was $350 billion, and we said you got to use this. I mean, I had a hearing to waiving the bill at Paulson, and the problem was, Maxine Waters and I, we had to get this bill through the House. Getting it through the House was harder because Chris had a more responsible set of Republicans to work with. The
Well,
House,
only 1/3 were up.
Right,
100% of the House is up.
That's a good point. So we had to really work hard to get this through, and to get the Democrats to support it. Maxine Waters and I stressed that we had foreclosure relief. And then Paulson gets the 350, and I was generally worked well with him and think highly of what he did in general, but I disagreed sharply here. He refused to use any of the first 350 for mortgage foreclosure relief, saying I need it all to keep the banking system going. Even the autos had to come out of a second group, another $75 billion. And that's what led people accurately to say, look, you just bailed out the bankers. No, we didn't bail out the bankers to help the bankers. We did it, as Chris said, to keep the economy from collapsing. But that was the failure. At that point, we lost the opportunity to use some of that money to alleviate foreclosure. And let me just say about foreclosure, not everybody who was being foreclosed upon was a worthy recipient. Some people did lie and did take
Some
money out.
overreached.
But there were some who were victimized. There were many who were victimized, and they should have been helped.
But it doesn't pass the first time. It doesn't do it. It takes the Dow Jones Industrial Average falling 2,700 points over a couple of days to, I guess, focus attention.
Among the Republicans. Remember, the Democrats, and people ask whatever happened to bipartisanship, and the answer is Barack Obama got elected, and the Republicans never gave him the cooperation we gave to George Bush and his administration. And so the Democrats voted heavily for it in the House. Republicans voted heavily against it. And it was only after the stock market dropped 700 points that some Republicans began to hear from their constituents that they better turn around. So on the second vote, a majority of Republicans still voted against it, but enough had switched because of that pressure.
I mean, it's almost not irrational on the part of those Republicans to be leery of voting for the bailout. I mean, they got in trouble in their elections that followed.
Well, yeah, but that's always a safe bet. I mean, Richard Shelby and I are good friends, but he'll tell you he never votes for a bailout. Whether it was New York City, whether it was Chrysler, whether it was this thing.
Always say no to bailout?
Start out saying no. You're not going to get too much trouble by voting no on these things.
The general way that we characterize that in the legislative body, when there's something you know should be done, but it's unpopular, you vote no and pray yes.
Yeah.
And the Republicans in the House thought, you know what, we're in the minority. Let the Democrats, even though it was their administration. And so there were some Republicans ideologically opposed to it, but there were many who just figured, let the Democrats take the rep.
And I don't know, Barney, I think Barney and I agree on this thing. I don't think we ever did anything in my 30 years in the Senate as unpopular as this, and yet as more important as the TARP bill.
You're sticking with that, even now?
No, absolutely. Had
Yeah.
we not done that, I mean, what we didn't do well enough, and I blame the administration for a lot of this here, it always should have been a consumer bottom-up approach to this thing, about consumers in the country. And too often, the language was always about stability of the institutions. And consumers kind of came in last.
Well, you spoke up about that in some key meetings, saying that that's what this should be about.
Yeah.
What was the reaction?
So
though,
to
Chris?
this day, it's considered, despite the fact billions have been returned, consumers have been made whole in many cases here, it's still seen as a bailout of financial institutions. And why did more people go to jail? You get that question almost daily.
The point is, we did write that, and we wrote the bill. So we wrote in authority to limit compensation to the top people.
Right.
We wrote in the requirements that they not just repay the loan with interest, but we have the warrants that Chris mentioned in case there were profits. We wrote in a mandate to do something about foreclosure, and here was our dilemma. At that point, the Republicans were running the show, and you can't run a program from Congress. You can authorize it. You can give them the tools, but you can't wield them yourselves. And the alternative for us would have been not to give them the authority. I mean, the idea would have been to give them the authority and have them use it. But giving them the authority, even though they weren't going to fully use it in ways that we like, was still a better choice than not giving them the authority at all and having it crash. And that was our frustration, and it's the limitations of being in the legislative body. They had their hands on the tools.
There's some remarkable stories, though, out of this. I got to share with you. That night of the vote, I asked everyone to vote from their seats in the Senate, which we rarely do. And I went around to members who were up in 40 days, Democrats and Republicans.
Who were up for
I had
re-election,
75
40
votes.
days.
I knew I had 75 votes. Senator Kennedy was very sick, and he was going to be the missing vote that evening, wasn't back. So the vote was 75 to 24. But I went to Democrats and Republicans and said, I'll never repeat your name or use your name, but if you want to vote no on this thing, I've got the votes. If I needed your vote, I'd tell you I did. And I'll never forget Gordon Smith, Republican from Oregon. I said that, made him the same offer. He said, great offer. He said, but I've got to see a constituent in the morning, and I don't know quite how I explain it, to be honest with you. I said, well, who's the constituent in the morning? He said, I'll never forget this. He said, the mirror.
The mirror. He has to look in the mirror.
and as a result, he lost 40 days later. Bob Bennett ultimately lost in Utah. Kay Bailey Hutchinson, you point out, in
Right,
Texas.
Mike
the
Castle.
primary. Mike Castle in Delaware.
In fact, what happened
4
is-
years later, they were still, this was a major campaign ad against anyone who voted for it.
You mentioned, that maybe it was rational. Yeah, it was rational in your own self-interest. Chris and I knew this was not the most popular thing. My staff said, when I had my toughest race when I first ran for office in 1980, but my second toughest race was my last race in 2010 because we had passed a wonderful bill and we had done these things, but it was very unpopular. And the problem is, it's hard to get political credit for averting disaster. I mean, I complained about it. My staff actually made up one copy of the bumper sticker I said I wanted to use. They were afraid I would use it. It said, here's what I want to run on. Things would have sucked worse without me. But you don't get any credit for that. But on the other hand, to make your point, Chris just told you, that reaction was a major piece of the rightward movement of the Republican Party because Republicans who voted for the legislation suffered badly in 2010.
And more conservative people replaced
They
him.
and
sure.
as Chris also pointed out, things don't go away. The 2010 Republican primaries, I think, terrorized an awful lot of Republicans, and it's a major factor in the Republican Party having moved that way to the right.
Well, I'm going to pick up on that theme in a second about the Republican Party and Trump and the financial crisis. We'll get to that. But let me ask you something. Part of this idea of it's so deeply unpopular, but Senator Dodd, you point out, you think it was crucial that you did it at the time.
Absolutely, no question.
But what part of do you want a second Great Depression or not wasn't made clear to people?
We tried, but they didn't believe it.
Or maybe you couldn't, though, because people were afraid of rattling the markets
No,
further?
by then,
But even worse than that is, it's one thing, I didn't believe it then.
Yeah.
We're both blessed and burdened with no memory in this country. And it's an asset and a liability. And when you go back and tell people 5 million homes went into foreclosure, $13 trillion in national wealth evaporated, 27 million people lost their jobs, iconic institutions, investment banks, commercial banks, credit unions, savings and loan disappeared or were nationalized or merged. It was an incredible set of issues that came to me. And people even today, you have to remind them of that to understand how much trouble we were actually in. And then, let alone today, which is harder.
and it's hard to persuade people, as I said, that you were going to have disaster. Americans thought well of the economy. By the way, there's one other factor on the foreclosure, and yes, we got the worst of both worlds on foreclosure. I think that the reaction to that gave us two political phenomena, the Tea Party and Occupy. because there were some people who were furious because we did some help for people. At least we talked about it. The Tea Party grew out of, what's the guy's name from CNBC? He said, we need a Tea Party. How dare they help these people with their mortgages? Nobody helped me with mine. So we had people on the right upset because we were talking about helping people avoid foreclosure. And then you had people on the left angry because we didn't help people do that.
But the Tea Party turned this into an electoral movement. Occupy Wall Street was more ambivalent about signing up people.
Be careful of that line. You got a great line.
Yeah, I will tell you. I have, Chris.
No, I'd love to hear the line.
Here it is. And I said, here was the problem. We had two movements came out of it, Tea Party on the right, Occupy on the left. And our problem was that the Tea Party registered to vote and got involved in primaries and took over the Republican Party. And the Occupy people smoked dope and had drum circles. And I will tell you that members of Congress are much more attuned to people who register and vote in primaries than the people who sit around smoking weed and being on drums.
But they figured that out now, on the
Finally,
left side.
Finally, but they didn't then. I was on the Bill Maher show with a representative of Occupy. They didn't have representatives, a person from Occupy. And I said, well, one of the things that troubled me was I never saw a voter registration table at an Occupy site. She said, well, we weren't into that. I agree that I think the left has learned now the lessons of 2016 and elsewhere, so people are going to be turning out. That's one of the things that I hope is going to be transformative this year.
Well, let me turn up the heat on this particular idea. Without the great financial crisis that you two helped fight, without the crisis, do we get President Donald Trump?
Well, look, at my view, I agree with Barney and others who made the case that it begins, if you want, we argue began with Vietnam. It could be. I think, frankly, the healthcare debate had more to do. That month of August in 2009, a year later, it was obviously didn't spring entirely there, but the town hall meetings that took over, and no one was talking about the financial reform bill in September of 2009. It was really all healthcare.
So by a year later, we were talking healthcare.
Yeah, but remember, we're also talking about a time when, despite the fact that there were Republicans in the House and Senate who were obnoxious about these bills, the fact is that people like Judd Gregg and I worked on the TARP legislation together, helped draft it. We were working with the Bush administration, with the Secretary of the Treasury, putting this together. That image, 75 people in the Senate actually vote for TARP, despite how unpopular it is. The Congress was demonstrating what it was capable of doing with good leadership and resolving problems. So the image was not all negative. You really were demonstrating your capacity to deal with a major problem and come together in a bipartisan way to do it. That wasn't a bad message for the country.
Yeah,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
first of all, I think Chris is, in what he said, is very powerful and should be underlined. But here's the problem. There was a sequence. The TARP, the bailout as it was called, was very prominent. Unfortunately, we never got as much attention for what followed in that sequence, which was the toughest financial reform and regulation since the New Deal, because healthcare took it off. It's like the public, the media can only focus on one big issue at a time. And if we had the perception that the crisis was followed then by reforms to clean up the thing, we might have been better off. But healthcare intervened, so you never got, when, and Chris has noted this, when you ask people what they thought about the financial reform bill, it's the most popular bill that's passed in a number of years. But you got to ask them; they don't bring it up because it was not as prominent. And as to Trump, I do think, look, he won by so little. We got Donald Trump because of less than 100,000 votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Given that, a whole lot of things could have taken it. So I think the answer is yes. But here's the trap I don't want us to get into. It wasn't the crisis that was the cause. It was the failure of policy that led to the crisis. And this is the frustration for us. Yeah. It was the right-wing policy of not regulating, of refusing to do regulation, of Greenspan refusing to use the powers he got. So the conservative philosophy brings on the crisis, and then we as Democrats, being responsible, step up and try to resolve it, working with some Republicans, and then we get blamed for it.
And we never could have, on the financial reform bill, if you had ever tried to pass it a year before we did or a year after, it never would have happened. The window opened in that one moment, and you even have enough sense to go through the window and get as much as you can done, or it closes very quickly, and it wouldn't have opened up again, in my view.
So the law that has each of your names on it, it is very focused on fixing and shoring up the banking system and making sure the banking system isn't as vulnerable the next time. Were you fighting the last battle, fighting the last war? Because what could happen next? God knows what could happen next. Might be something else.
The war was still on. The war wasn't over. We ended the war. Yeah, I mean, it's like saying, well, when you were in World War II, when you were fighting Hitler, were you fighting the last war? No, we were fighting Hitler. I mean, what we were doing in the bill was remember, this stuff was ongoing. So what we were fighting was that. And yes, we did, I think, substantially diminish the likelihood of those things happening again. We never said, nobody could say that'll be the end of everything. But it wasn't, this wasn't only looking back at history. We weren't fighting the problems of the New Deal. We were fighting an ongoing set of practices, and if we didn't put an end to them, they would have kept going.
And there's several points. I mean, underlying, which you cannot legislate, but the lack of confidence, consumer confidence, investor confidence had been shattered because of what occurred. And so what we try to do with the bill is not eliminate future crises, they're going to happen, but create tools, new tools, the ones that Bernanke and Paulson claim they didn't have. So the stress tests for banks, the transparency in the derivatives market, the creation of the FSOC, so that they could actually sit down together, consider that radical idea, and look over the horizon and say, are there product lines or institutions that are posing systemic risk?
This is what I often envision as like the war room watching over the financial system.
You know, a law says they have to meet 4 times a year. They've been meeting 30 times a year on their own because they realize the value of it. And so that's a very critical, really a huge asset for the future.
And initially to come out of the Senate, Jack Reed, we created the Office of Financial Research, which was a set of experts whose sole function was to look ahead and see what the problems might be. And by the way, the Trump administration, that's one of the things which they have underfunded. They couldn't abolish it statutorily because they just don't believe that we should be as ready. And I would just add one other thing that list that Chris gave, and that was, and this was the one area that Paulson and Bernanke did complain. I mean, you saw it in Lehman and AIG, the opposites. When Lehman failed, they didn't do anything. When AIG was going to fail, they did everything. And what they said was their lawyers had told them if a major institution couldn't pay its debts, they either had to let it go bankrupt and pay nothing or step in and pay everything. And the key thing that we did in what's called orderly liquidation was to give them the authority to move in, take over the institution, and pay only some of the debts, enough to keep things from spiraling out of control, and then levy on other financial institutions to get that money back. So that was another important piece.
And one more piece, which Barney brought up last night, and they're still angry about it. Too big to fail, not only politically because you not get away with what we were able to do in 2008, but legally you cannot do it. They wanted to leave open the window so that a major financial institution could get financial aid to bail them out.
That there could be a future bailout.
And we shut it down. Now they could change the law.
In fact, we teased, and some of the experts, even Bernanke and Paulson and Geithner, who we worked with, if you ask them, they've been supportive, and unlike a lot of other Republicans, they believe that what we did with derivatives, what we did with bank capital, what we did in these regulatory things were fine. But they are upset that we did shut down too strongly the possibility of unlimited infusion of taxpayer funds into failed institutions.
Well, they just wrote a piece in Common in the New York Times.
At the dinner they had last night, and Chris and I were there, and when they got through talking, I said, maybe a little mischievously, oh, by the way, I have a question for you three guys. How you doing lining up sponsors for that bill you're pushing that's going to give back the authority to do all the bailouts? And I got laughter in return.
But there's a very serious point here, which is you didn't outlaw future crises.
No, you can't do that. That's
right?
ridiculous.
So something might happen, and what if they got to go back to Congress?
In the first place, in a democracy, yes, sometimes you do. And by the way, we showed last time that there was the capacity. That was Chris's point. They went to Congress, and Congress responded in 2 ways, and that's what we dealt with the crisis, and then we put in a pretty good set of rules. But again, quote my husband, he said, well, first you guys were the EMTs, and then you were the surgeons. And the result was a pretty good one. But here's the deal. We have given them the authority to intervene, but they have to put the institutions out of business, which some of the institutions don't like. Here's the issue. We have said that you don't want unpaid debts spiraling through so that A can't pay B, and then B can't pay D, E, and F, and they can't pay the others. But they have to put the institution out of business. And what they're saying is, well, maybe we want to go that far. And the other thing I would say is this. If that's the issue, then the country has to decide it. Here, well, let me make this explicit. What they've said is what we did in there, the ability to put a major institution out of business and then pay only some of the debts, that's not going to work, because if a really big financial institution is threatened, there would be great political pressure to save it. So therefore, they would need the money to save it rather than put it out of business. And having gone through what we went through, we know that's wrong. In fact, if a big financial institution was failing, there would be political pressure to shoot everybody in it, not to save them.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because this was the vulnerability politically we faced all the way through this. The too big to fail. In fact, there was memos passed around Republican circles, how to defeat the bill, say it's too big to fail, it's still alive and well. We actually lowered the threshold for prudential supervision to $50 billion, which we just fundamentally changed. That was driven by Republicans because they constantly said too big to fail is still alive. Put aside whether politically you could do it or not, substantively that was the case. The very first amendment that passed the Senate in the consideration of the bill was an amendment offered by Richard Shelby and myself, which basically called an end to too big to fail. But we had to emphasize that point. The too big to fail was behind. Had we not done that, I think this would have been a difficult bill to pass. And I needed 60 votes, not 51. I needed 60. And all I got was 60. One less and the bill's dead on this thing. But for Susan Collins, Olympia Snowe, and the new senator, Scott Brown from Massachusetts, we were able to get the 60th vote and pass the legislation. But too big to fail was always
we did, and what we put it instead, and it was in both versions, and we then had to reconcile it, as we call it in the conference. No bank is too big to fail. They fail. What we have said is, if they can't pay their debts, then we put them out of business.
In an orderly way.
And that's what it's called. And by the way, it anticipates that it may be that they got so indebted that the federal government will have to put in some money, but there's a mandate. Treasury Secretary then has to get that back from others. But the other point is this, is that all the rules we put in about capital, restrictions on bad loans, on restricting derivatives, requiring that derivatives be funded, we made it much less likely that they would have that degree of debt. But even if that fails, and they do have more debt than they can pay off, they get put out of business, and the debt is paid in part, not entirely, only as much as you have to, and we get that back.
But what do you make of this, gentlemen? Marketplace, our show, was talking to Neil Kashkari, who you worked with during the great battles.
Conversion on the road to Damascus.
Oh, is that what happened? So he's the head of the Minneapolis Fed now, and he told us the other day, he thought, and this is a quote from him, the biggest banks are absolutely still too big to fail. If big banks ran into trouble today, the taxpayers would be on the hook because the administration would be faced with the same choice we were faced with, I guess, back then. Let them collapse and potentially bring down the U.S. economy or use taxpayer money to bail them out. And I think, he said, that people end up using taxpayer money to bail them out. He's not so
Two things about that. I think I called his bluff, and he hasn't responded. He said over a year ago the banks were too big and had to be reduced in size. Did you ask him what size they should be reduced to? Because he doesn't answer that. Yeah. He has no, what size?
Oh, that there's no answer to the idea of what is the right size.
Yeah,
yes.
It's not size of a bank. It's whether or not they pose systemic risk, how much capital,
and
liquidity.
how indebted are they? I mean, look, Lehman Brothers was $750 billion. So if the answer is, if you're not going to deal with their debt, they're all too big. But he says, he's always abandoned that. But he just said what I told you they're saying. He says if the bank is in trouble, though, you have to use taxpayer money. As a matter of fact, our law says that they can't.
They cannot.
They would be breaking the law. In fact, that's where you just alluded to the article that you saw from Bernanke, Paulson, and Geithner. They are correcting Kashkari by pointing out that what he's afraid would happen can't happen under the law.
Unless you change the law.
Right.
Change the law.
Instead, what you have to do, exactly right, and that's what we tease them, because nobody's going to help. They haven't got anybody to vote for that new law. What Kashkari misstates is that the law says you can't use taxpayer money to keep them alive. You can use taxpayer money to pay part of the debts after you have liquidated them, but then you get that money back from other financial institutions under the law. What he's saying and others are is, if it came to that, that's what I said to you, there would be too much political pressure and the administration of power would be afraid to use the law, and instead they would say, oh no, we can't let Bank X or Bank Y go under, we have to keep it alive. And that totally misreads the politics of America.
And not only that, but it's a good point made earlier, because we're conscious of that. The orderly unraveling, so that you have not the chaotic ripple effect throughout the industry, in a sense, We've set up a process whereby that can occur in a fashion that we think works.
The living wills and all this
And
stuff.
they're doing
you did.
FDIC and who handles the thing and knows how to do this and so forth. So again, we think that would help. So you can, one, you can't do it, Barney just said, but also if it comes to that, we've set up the architecture that allows for that orderly dismantling of an
Yeah,
institution.
you got to ask, does he think they're going to ignore the law? Again, that's, you saw Bernanke, Paulson, and Geithner say, no, you can't do what Kashkari said is going to happen. The other thing I do want to go back, because I was very disappointed in him, because he was talking about these banks are too big and we have to reduce them. And I asked him, I asked several people, how big is too big? There's no answer to that. Because as Chris said, it's not, size alone isn't the issue. The question is, what kind of shape are they in? How indebted are they? Can they pay off the debts? And I don't know what Kashkari's answer is. By the way, did he tell you what his response, what the solution is?
No.
He said they're too big to fail. So what, he doesn't.
He didn't give us a number.
Well, okay.
Are Canadian banks too big? They're larger than the U.S.
Yeah,
banks.
and fewer. That's why I've lost respect for Kashkari's intellectual approach to this, because he says they're too big to fail. What would he do about it? Does he, or does he again, does he think they're going to break the law? I can't make sense out of what he's saying.
Let me switch topics here. In the law, you called it the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. It came to be known as the CFPF, the
Consumer
Financial
Financial
Protection Bureau.
The Bureau
Thank you.
got switched.
Yeah, it got switched recently. It's being reined in by the present managers of it. What do you think? Is it doomed, this thing you set up? under
No, here's
Dodd-Frank?
the deal. As much as the conservatives hate it, let's be clear what they hate about it. It's been very successful. Chris had the statistics where he told you how much money they brought in for people. There was this philosophy that goes
Well,
back.
$12.4 billion in relief to over 31 million consumers is the claim.
It goes back to Ronald Reagan's, government is not the answer to the problem, government is the problem. It's deeply rooted in conservative philosophy that the private sector brings all the good and the government does only harm. And here is a case where the government is protecting citizens against the private sector. And they hate that the way the devil hates holy water. It is absolutely, it hurts their theology. So that's why they get so excited about what's really not the major piece of the bill. And so what they're doing is not enforcing it. But here's the point. It's still so popular that for all that they hate it, there's been no legislative effort to diminish its powers or change its structure, unlike healthcare, where they kept doing that. And so, yes, as long as Donald Trump is president, it won't use its powers. But as soon as you get a more sensible president, all those powers will be fully there to be reused.
Right, but no legislative changes, but they are changing the CFPB's ability. I'm just going to call it the Bureau from now on. That's what you call it in the bill a lot of times, the Bureau.
By the way, can I just say something?
Yeah.
Call it whatever you want, who cares?
Maybe it needed a better name to start with. But the Bureau
Are you serious?
is...
People get hung up on it.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
That's not the issue.
No, of course it's
But
not
the point is this, yes, they are not using it now, but it will be fully in effect the next time a president comes in who believes in it.
Well, because we did, let me just tell you, having had a lot of meetings before we even got close to passing the financial reform bill, meeting with the top 13 financial institutions, a block or so from where we're sitting today, and asking them in preparation for going ahead, what are the things that you're most concerned about? There were two in an hour-long meeting, executive compensation and a Consumer Protection Bureau. That was it. That's it. Those two. And I can tell you who's in the room, you'd know every name in the room. And that was their concerns.
And it's because it's ideological. They hate the notion.
Hate the idea.
This has vindicated our view that the government can protect the citizens against abuse by the private sector with no harm to the economy. By the way, that's the other point I want to stress right here. Trump and a few of his allies keep talking about how our bill has crippled the financial sector and done all this damage. But at the same time, they argue this is the strongest economy we've ever had. Now, how is it possible to cripple a critical aspect of the economy and still the economy works better than ever did?
And the two great arguments were it'll destroy profitability and lending. Profitability last quarter was $60 billion, $12 billion above what the previous quarter.
Banks have been very profitable.
Yeah, and the borrowing is $100 million more, and the balance sheet's going up. So people are lending money, the banks are profitable, and yeah, certainly maybe the tax bill may have had some impact, but the idea that this bill that we passed was going to kill both profitability and lending is ridiculous on its face.
It's just interesting to me that the Bureau is being cut back to the benefit, you would argue, the benefit of parts of the financial services industry that doesn't like it. But there's no outcry in support of the Bureau. This is just not happening.
A couple of reasons. First of all, it's not that visible. It's hard to demonstrate. Again, it is hard to demonstrate things that they should have done and didn't. On the other hand, their recognition that it's popular, they won't let it be an issue. Yeah. You say it's being cut back. The powers are not being used, but what do they hate? Well, they don't like the fact that it's funded automatically without going through the appropriation process, which the Senate did. They haven't tried to change that. They don't like the fact that it's a single director rather than a commission. They haven't tried to change that. They haven't legislated anything because none of them want to vote to cut it back. So if you simply have an administrator who doesn't use the authority, that's hard to dramatize.
But you ask a good question, because I think this is what was clearly part of our thinking, and that is the funding scheme. Because what normally happens is so beyond the realm of news every day, and that is starving an agency.
Congress can tweak the purse strings.
And that's how you kill them. You don't kill them by, it's no longer a question of a coup d'etat. It's just solely destroy the institutions.
But Congress can't in the case of the Bureau. They can't do it. You set it up with this cool
I would have,
system.
frankly, with the bill, I would have liked to have self-funded the SEC if we could. And make it, because it certainly collects enough money to pay for itself every year from bad behavior. And so we did this through the Federal Reserve System, specifically to avoid what they did with the Federal Trade Commission and others over the years, starve them to death. And the public doesn't really get that.
And that hasn't changed. So I agree, yes, under Trump. But by the way, that's true of the Environmental Protection Administration. Yeah. It's true of a lot of things. You get people in power who don't believe in using the tools. There's no way you can force them to use them.
I mean, you saw the head guy from the Bureau who does student loans quit not too long ago.
But again,
who says they're
when
not
you get,
enforcing
if the next time a president gets in office who believes in this, those powers are there. They have not been diminished going forward. They're not being used. But and as far as popularity, they try to repeal the health care bill. They've tried to vote on other stuff. They try to repeal some other regulations. They haven't put the Consumer Bureau to one test because the Republicans don't want to vote on it.
I want to go slightly back in time before we leave the subject of the Bureau. It does go back in time, but I didn't get the story from you, Chris Dodd. In late 2008, I think it is, before we're at crafting Dodd-Frank and we're dealing with TARP, you identified the crucial issue for the government's response to be something like restoring consumer confidence. Yeah. But what was the story? Apparently the other tycoons in the room with you didn't get what you were saying. They looked at you, blankly?
No, and I'll tell you another quick anecdote to make my point here. I was talking to a manager some years ago of a sovereign wealth funds. This guy parked a huge amount of the country's money in our country. And I said, why do you do that? I mean, I'm just curious, why you do that. He said, for two reasons. He said, first of all, you're pretty good at making money. He said, but I want to tell you something. The second reason is actually more important than the first. He said, I'll never forget what he said. He said, I've never lost a wink of sleep worrying about the fairness, the stability of the system. I've made money, I've lost money, but I've never worried about the integrity of the financial services system in the United States. And what happened is we lost that reputation through all of this. And so confidence, while I can't legislate it, everything we had to do was designed to restore confidence, hopefully, and secondly, to make sure that the policemen on the street, if you will, the regulators, would have enough information to make good decisions. I can't force them to do that. They can disregard all of that if they want to. But don't ever tell me again we didn't give you the tools to identify a problem and respond to it accordingly.
You would think that would be self-evident, but apparently people didn't understand what you were saying at first.
It's short-term thinking. It's quarter-to-quarter stuff. It's, I'll get my 5 years in and get out in a lot of cases,
But I got to go back to this thing about, without the financial crisis, do we or do we not get Donald Trump? Regular human beings lost faith in the system. They think that maybe the social contract before the crisis was something like, well, let the plutocrats do what they got to do, but they're watching out for us. They won't let it fall apart. Yeah. It started to fall apart, and now people are like, no, they're not watching
out. What's going on? You got Turkey, you got Hungary, you got Poland, you got Austria, you got the Philippines. We're seeing this kind of governance emerge globally. It isn't just here.
Nationalist governance.
Yeah.
The financial crisis accelerated it and accentuated it, but that's not the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the nature of growth in developed societies since the 80s, and this is now acknowledged, growth from the Depression through World War II and the post-war period, growth was good for everybody. We grew developed economies in a way that helped the high-end people, it helped working people, they could go make glass, make autos, et cetera. And then, beginning in the 80s, and this is, I think, fairly well acknowledged, growth began to be a two-edged sword. It produced more overall wealth in a country, but it exacerbated the way in which it was distributed. So if you were high-end in America or in other developed societies, if you had a lot of skills, a lot of education, sophisticated in technology, you made money. If your only working asset was an ability to go work hard without a lot of skills, you could hurt. And so I think that's the basis for Trump or for Brexit or for the five-star movement in Italy. It is that economic growth in the developed West has evolved to the point where it has a very unequal effect in the economy. And you have Thomas Piketty talking about how capitalism has become both an increaser of wealth and an increaser of inequity. Now, what happened was, and I do agree when you talk about the plutocrats, I think what happened was in 2010, the perception that the bailout was only for the banks and not others convinced a lot of people that this unequal result was not simply the workings of an impersonal economy, but the elite was trying to screw them. So that added to it. But the underlying problem has been the economic reality, and that's been an ongoing issue, not just in America, but in, and I was just reading a very good article by two economists at MIT in 2007, talking about how we are having this increasing inequality in the society, and that is undermining faith in democracy.
And someone comes along and promises that I can make you great again, and sort of obliquely refer to a time that Barney's just described here when those opportunities existed, and failing to recognize that automation and technology and all of these other matters have intervened in a way, making it difficult for that 50-year-old guy who's just lost his job, who's sitting in a VFW hall and watching his kids move back into the house, and someone comes along and says, I can solve your problem.
But so you two Democrats going to let the Trump team offer their approach to this? I mean, because you've identified it as a similar problem.
That's a silly question. I'm sorry.
No, what I'm saying is you've talked about the problem. So what is the response from your
Well, why would you phrase it
party?
as are we going to let them?
No, I'm
sorry.
teasing you, but
Not very effectively. Let me just say,
not
no.
amused by my question. I stipulate. But what's so you didn't complete your thought. The thought was, so what do you do about it from your perspective?
I do believe that the Democrats have to be more explicit. Well, here's the deal, and I do have differences with both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who each tried to do a lot to offset the unequalizing effect, but not enough. And I think what happened was people on the liberal side have still accepted a framework in which growth is the dominant goal. And then recognizing that growth will cause some problems, after you promote growth, you then deal with the question of the inequality it brings. And I think you have to make them equal. And the example in both cases is trade. I wish that both Clinton and Obama both did with trade was say, look, trade is good, it helps the whole economy, it hurts some people, so let's pass a trade bill, and then we will work on helping the people who are hurt. And the problem was that the conservatives, the business community, the Republicans said, okay, we'll help you pass a trade bill, but then when you want to do something to promote unions or to promote increase people's health care, et cetera, we're not with you. So I think going forward, the liberal position has to be, yes, we are going to promote economic growth, but integral to that are going to be ways that we deal with the unfairness and offset that unfairness at the same time.
Even when mainstream economists say, wait, dealing with inequality, that's inefficiency in economic terms.
Yes, and I think that's the mistake that mainstream economists have been making. I think there's a kind of it's time to go beyond growth as the number one issue. And in America today, the fact is that, and this has been the case for 20 years and it's getting worse, growth has a very unequal effect. And by the way, they may not like this, and this goes back to what we talked about before. What some of the business community has to understand is they don't have the option of doing that anymore. I mean, they got Donald Trump, they got Brexit, they're getting the five-star movement. Look, it's like, I think it's like it was 90 years ago when there was
90 years ago.
90 years ago, there was a loss of faith in democracy because capitalism wasn't producing enough wealth. and you got Keynes, and you got this new idea that governments had to produce wealth. And so you then, beginning in the 30s and then into the post-war period, okay, democracy looks okay now because it's producing the wealth. But I think what we're seeing today is in some ways like that. That is, yeah, producing wealth is no longer enough to sustain faith in democracy. You've got to produce the wealth in a way that promotes fairness as well.
And they don't, and also it's probably, the language about dealing with the inequality of taking care of the unemployed worker, that guy I just described it, seems sort of flat to me. I mean, we'll have job training programs or something. We use the same language for 3 or 4 decades. And
Well, Charles Schumer used it with his new way forward that he offered last year, which was one of the 3 planks was training.
Yeah, can you imagine? You have 2 years with an infrastructure, huge set of problems in the country. You would think both Republicans and Democrats, given the absolute need of infrastructure improvements and so forth, where real jobs could be created, would make some sense to do it. But too often the language doesn't seem to have the vitality that growth does, economic growth.
You got me. Training is good. Retraining, 57-year-old coal miner is probably not going to become a computer programmer. I mean, I couldn't become one, and it just. So what you do? There are other things the Democrats have been talking about more, and we should. Unions, a major factor in the erosion of the incomes of average people. Economists now will agree has been the anti-union activity. It's frustrating to us that Trump talks about the working people and does such anti-union stuff. But there's raising the minimum wage. I think you're beginning to see. There were a couple of things that would help: raising the minimum wage and helping people with their medical care costs, expanding Medicare in some ways, either lowering the age or having a public option. Those are things that respond to that, and I agree that I think both Obama and Clinton were slow to see the need to make sure that pro-growth and pro-fairness went together. But I don't think, by the Obama administration, while the president was for trade, overwhelmingly Democrats were voting the other way, saying, no, we got to do it together. I think the next time you see a Democratic majority in the House or the Senate going forward and in the presidential campaign, there will be much more explicit set of programs, increasing health care, minimum wage, protecting unions, that deal with this.
Let's get back to Dodd-Frank, this one of the crucial achievements of both of you, has each of your names on the bill, on the law.
Actually, originally the motion was to call the bill Frank Dodd. And Barney pointed out at 4:30 in the morning, they'll think it's one person. We can't have that out.
Frank Dodd.
Yeah.
Okay. Good old Frank Dodd. Who is he? Was he in the House or Senate? You were fighting the war. You make the point in this discussion in real time as you're working on that bill. So how much could you take on? But there's a lot to worry about in the financial system that Dodd-Frank doesn't fully address. A lot of financial stuff goes on outside of banks, in hedge funds and money market funds. They call it the shadow banking system.
Well, the bill does give them the authority to deal with that. The bill doesn't just regulate banks, and this is one of the things that we're part of. Chris talked about the Financial Stability Oversight Council. It gives them the right to go after activity. So they've done some stuff about money market funds. In fact, I was talking to Janet Yellen yesterday, who was concerned that there may not be as much willingness to use some of the authority they have. But the FSOC did make some changes in the requirements for money market funds. So the law does not just cover banks. It obviously covers financial institutions. It doesn't cover hedge funds as fully. That I agree with. But it has the right to step in if they see there's an issue.
It's a major problem. This is one of the major complaints of the bill. The fact that GE, MetLife, and a few others, where we looked at these sort of shadow banking, not your classic definition, and that people have complained that this was overreaching in a sense. Now you can make a case depending upon the circumstances of each one, and there's some legitimacy to that. But the pace of legislation allows, except in the area of hedge funds, for us to actually be directly involved with institutions that don't specifically qualify as a bank.
Yeah, for instance, GE, because of what we did, divested itself of its financial entity. GE started out as an industrial company. Then they went into being a big financial company, and to avoid the supervision they were getting, they divested that. And even as to hedge funds per se aren't regulated, but the financial instruments in which they deal are. For instance, derivatives. Nobody now can get involved in these massive derivative transactions, putting nominally hundreds of billions at stake, without there being a protection against somebody incurring debt that they can't pay off. They go through exchanges. You have to post margin. You have to have capital.
People may not understand that before Dodd-Frank, this is all kind
Totally
of mysterious,
opaque.
right?
Totally opaque.
It's opaque.
Yep. And well, AIG, here's the story. AIG came to the Fed in September and said, we have $85 billion in debt we can't pay off. A week later, Bernanke said to us, oh, and we're going to need, he was listing how much they needed for the TARP. We need $85 billion for AIG. We said, oh, you already told us about that. He said, oh, I'm sorry. That's an additional $85 billion. It turns out AIG was $170 billion in debt beyond what they could pay off because they had been allowed to make promises without putting up the capital. And so what we changed in the law was it would be literally impossible to get $170 billion in debt now without having some capital to pay it off. Just like you can't, people know about margin for stocks. Well, yeah, you had to put up margin when you were buying stocks. You had to put up a certain percentage. But you could make a commitment with derivatives with nothing at all behind it. That's not possible anymore.
Did you follow this apparent loophole that's developed in Dodd-Frank that if it was argued by the financial services industry that they could move some of their riskier trading, derivatives trading, to offshore foreign versions of themselves and therefore beyond the reach of Dodd-Frank. And I think it was the CFTC was going to close the loophole, but that was just before the last presidential election. It's not closed.
Well, the law is still there. And in fact, it's a very good point. They tried when we were still there to pass a law when the Republicans took over Congress. Well, part of the problem is we did not anticipate losing control of Congress in 2010 because if we'd kept that, there would have been more, we would have funded these things better. They had a bill that was going to exempt the overseas affiliates of American institutions from derivative regulation by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And then in the midst of that, the London whale surfaced, which was a loss by JP Morgan Chase, supposedly the best run bank, of billions and billions of dollars, and they didn't even know how much it was. So the law was not changed. So you're right, they didn't complete the regulatory authority, but the statutory authority for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to fully supervise those overseas activities hasn't changed.
Now, you've thought about this a lot, Congressman Frank, but I want to get you to address this because you just opened up this important area of inquiry, which is you can write a law, but you got to enforce it. And as in the case that you mentioned in the 1990s of the Fed getting authority to better scrutinize the subprime market, and maybe Alan Greenspan wasn't as diligent as he should be doing that, does Dodd-Frank go far enough to make the regulators
It goes
really
as far
crack
as you
down?
can. You can't make it.
So is it frustration that you can't make them?
But that's always been the history.
Sure.
You go back to the banking laws of the 1930s. They were like 25 pages long. The rest was totally delegated to regulators. I can't imagine having votes, about 51-49 votes
On every little thing.
Well, I don't like metaphors in general, but there's one that's very relevant. You can't push on a string. You can. I mean, it's always the case. You can stop people from doing bad things, but I don't know how you could do much more, especially since some of them are necessarily qualitative. I will say this though, even with the Trump administration, that bill is being administered much better than people might have thought, and the system is being run much more soundly and safely than it was before the bill was passed. And the reason is that the powers are there, and unless you're a pretty irresponsible guy or woman, and you're in charge of an agency, and it has the powers to do something, you're going to be a little worried in the back of your mind that if you vigorously don't use those powers and something goes wrong, you're going to be in trouble. I do think that the Trump people probably are, some of them may be more willing to hold back, but the powers, and by the way, if you look at some of the regulators, Jay Powell, the new head of the Federal Reserve,
Very good.
there's no difference between the way he is administering those powers and the way Janet Yellen did.
Done a
What
good job.
you're going to say?
Well, Jay Powell, I think, is very good. We're lucky to have him in that job. But I was going to make a case to exactly your point. I mean, you may have recently here, the Consumer Protection Bureau was issuing a regulation to ban these sort of mandates that you have on arbitration, where you couldn't go to sue somebody, you had to agree to arbitration. And of course, the law gives the agency the right to do that. What they've done, of course, is then challenge that successfully. So today, when you sign these agreements here, you're signing clauses here that require you individually to arbitrate, not collectively do so or file a lawsuit. There's an example where the law still gives the agency the opportunity to regulate, but regulations will be subject to jurisprudence, and our ability to prohibit them from doing so would be unconstitutional. In my
We're
view.
talking about inequality before. I haven't asked you more directly about executive compensation. Average pay for all CEOs is up 72% between '09 and last year. Last couple of years, some if not a lot of that jump has been the rising stock market. But the typical worker's pay is essentially flat. It keeps staying essentially flat. Dodd-Frank deals with that through, the main mechanism is transparency, right? That's what you tried to do?
Well, say on pay, we did a lot of
beyond
different ways. We don't
transparency.
force it, but I know they don't like it. Once every 3 years, the boards can vote on these things here. It's a difficult area to legislate in because of the opposition was so strong to this. I mentioned earlier to you the two issues that I was told over and over again: compensation and the Consumer Protection Bureau were the two really big points to this.
We gave the shareholders the right to control the top executive compensation. On the whole, they haven't used it, again, but they have used it some. Vikram Pandit lost his job as a CEO of
Citi,
Citicorp because of a negative vote on pay, and there have been some cases where it has been used. I noticed The Economist magazine, which didn't like the law because they really have a great free enterprise. They hate to admit that the government was needed, but they, in their most recent analysis, said, yeah, the say on pay has restricted. And say on pay goes beyond transparency. It lets the shareholders vote every year.
Yeah.
They can do it as much if they want to wait till every 3 years, but they have to give the shareholders a vote at least once every 3 years on the compensation of the top executives. And if the shareholders can vote no, and nobody's going to defy that. The other is the publishing the ratio, which is Senator Bob Menendez pushed for that.
The CEO pay over the typical
Average
worker's pay,
pay.
the
Right,
average
yeah,
worker.
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And while
Typical one,
that's
yeah.
not binding,
Median.
apparently it has some effect because the CEO hated it like poison.
Well, the argument, you know what the argument is. The argument is it makes CEOs look especially bad if it's a type of industry that has a lot of lower paid workers.
Well, then if I were them, I'd go to work in another industry. I mean, the notion that, oh, poor CEO who's making $27 million, we hurt his feelings. That's tough. If you have those
It is
kind
very
of
embarrassing, though, when you show up on the wrong part of that list.
Well, that's
Yeah,
true.
good. Then
related-
take another job or take a
related
pay
issue
cut.
in
By
the-
the way, live on $20 million instead of 27.
Related issue that, again, this doesn't get a lot of attention, obviously, the say on pay. Also related to that is the whistleblower provisions of the bill,
Very important.
which was here again. It was controversial, and frankly, I think Barney and I both had our reservations a bit about it. The idea would possibly see a deluge of whistleblowing accusations because you can bypass the business you work for and go directly to the SEC.
With anonymity.
With anonymity.
Yeah,
And of course,
You don't have, you
and
don't
the SEC was worried about it. It turned out all of our fears, or whatever
Very
fears we had,
successful.
non-existent. They've been a great success and made a difference in the last several years.
And by the way,
Just
again,
that.
I'm going to go back.
Are you familiar with the position?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, yes, we've tried to cap CEO, at least restrain CEO pay, but more importantly, we're trying to raise the pay of the workers. I mean, with unions and with better taxation and with other factors that would increase their pay.
Because, you know, early on you lived through that when the AIG bonuses happened. That did not make anybody's life easier except for the people who got their bonus in the end. But do you think, in a sense, the outrage that erupted when AIG still paid out the bonuses may have helped you with the broader reform that you were working
No,
on?
I think it just made people angrier, and anger is not.
Well, you harnessed some of the anger for reform.
Yeah, well, the reform, actually what helped us, particularly in April of 2010, as the Senate was taking up the bill, we had done it in 2009, you had the Goldman Sachs fiasco where it turned out they had bet against some of the things they were selling people. They were selling citizens certain investments and then themselves making investments that assumed the things they were selling wouldn't do well. And Senator Carl Levin, who was a great investigator, had a very good hearing on that. So that thing, that helped us.
So, gentlemen, they're tinkering with your Dodd-Frank, and Congressman Frank, you don't seem to mind too much.
No, Chris and I were very much involved in this. Here's the deal. If you go back to that, the change they made, we both disagreed. We had a $50 billion limit on when you went into supervision.
Because the Republicans drove us to that.
We both felt 100, 125 would have been okay. They went from 125, they went to 250. So there may be, I don't know, a dozen banks.
Essentially, we're talking about the size of the bank at which they are
Heightened
subject to the
supervision. Heightened
most
supervision.
strict.
Yeah.
But they still, the other
Regulation.
rules are still there. They're still subject to the Volcker rule about not using their own money for derivatives. They're still subject to the restrictions that say you have to have more capital. The major thing that bill did was to relax the rules for the banks of 10 billion and under, which are the ones that are the real political crowd. And if you go back and look at what people like Senator Warren and others were afraid of, many of them were saying it wasn't just what was being done in that bill. They were afraid this was the beginning of a process of nibbling away. And the
Thin end of the wedge is the idea.
yeah, and it turned out that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
That was the total wedge, and that's what makes us feel more secure. That passage of that fairly small change was the last change that's going to happen. It changed the political dynamic. The Democratic senators who pushed for that now feel totally secure in not having to support any other change, and there will be no further change.
Because those community banks there's a lot of them, and they have
they're
political
in
power.
everybody's district.
And for the bill, Dodd-Frank, Cam Fine, who runs the association, we dealt with him on a daily basis. The community banks supported the Dodd-Frank legislation. But let me also mention to you that Jay Powell points out, the Federal Reserve has maintained its jurisdiction for heightened supervision of lending institutions between 150 and 250.
They can pick them up.
And Jay Powell is not going to give that up. And so even though they did this in the bill, per se, the Federal Reserve maintains that ability.
Basically, what they did in the bill was, Chris said, they kind of bought off the smaller banks. 10 billion is not tiny, but they're the ones in everybody's district, and they sponsor the Little League, and they have those crazy TV commercials. But the result is that there was now no significant political pressure to weaken anything else. And with regard to the biggest banks, there was no change. There's no relaxation in the rules on derivatives, for example. No weakening of the Consumer Bureau legislation. So no, I think what we now have is a confirmation that 90+% of that law is going to remain on the books.
You know, there are 5,000 banks in the country. There are 111 of them that have assets in excess of 10 billion. You know, the irony, only in Washington would you consider a small bank a bank that has $10 billion in it. I mean, you know.
But you're not partial to the change, Mr. Frank, because you sit on a board of Signature Bank. That's a medium-sized bank. They might stand to.
Yes, and in 2013, before I had ever heard of Signature Bank, Dan Tarugo, who was the best regulator, I thought, in the Federal Reserve, in a speech in Chicago, said that he thought the 50 billion was too low and should be raised to 100 billion. And he said he thought that banks that had less than 10 billion in assets should be exempt from the Volcker rule. And again, before I'd ever heard of Signature Bank, I said publicly that means I thought that was absolutely right. And so, yes, I then went on the board of a bank several years later that would have been affected by the 50 billion, but it had no effect on my position because I had said several years publicly before that and had written that I was for that change.
While we're talking about careers here in 2018, Chris Dodd, you joined a law firm that does consulting here?
Well, they're a large law firm. They do a lot more. There are a lot of practices, but financial services is one of the practices.
Yeah,
And,
so you're not
Arnold
gonna-
and Porter, since you've raised it, I'm not just going to say a firm. I want to give them proper attention here.
Arnold and Porter.
Porter is a great law firm going back years.
But you're
in
going
this
to use
town.
your position there to roll back Dodd-Frank?
No, of course not. In fact, they've been great. I've joined on amicus briefs and so forth, which support our legislation. And obviously, they don't have a huge client base that isn't necessarily in favor of Dodd-Frank, but that's not unique to that law firm or any law firm.
So the implication of my question is there a conflict of interest, you sitting on the board of
Yeah, I
Signature
want to
Bank?
say, one, I've been strongly for the tough regulation, but the best thing that happened to the bank, of which I am a board member in the past few years, was the Trump tax cut, which benefited that bank.
And you were opposed to the Trump tax
I
cut.
did as much as I could to oppose that tax cut, and that was if I was going to be guided by the bank's financial interests, I would have been a supporter of the tax cut. Instead, I did whatever I could to urge people to vote against it.
All right, big picture here. We've been talking about the achievements of the Dodd-Frank law, but what worries you most now about the financial system? Surely your worries are not over.
My worry is that I don't know what will happen next. Here's the position with the financial system and others. The private sector innovates, and at some point, the innovations outstrip existing regulations. And the mistake is if you wait too long. That was the problem in the 90s and the 2000s. It wasn't so much deregulation as non-regulation. Brooks Lee Bourne tried to get the government to do something about the derivatives. We tried to get Alan Greenspan to do something about the By the way, you said, let me just be clear about Alan Greenspan. In his memoir in 2006, Economics in the Time of Turbulence, he said, I'm getting this almost verbatim, I think it was on page 206, you could look it up, because Casey Stengel used to say, I know that these subprime loans carried a high risk that they would not be repaid, but it was a risk worth taking because you cannot have a capitalist system unless there is broad support for property rights. And by making these loans, we encourage a lot of these people to be supportive of property rights. It's a political, ideological justification for allowing loans to be made that he said, quote, had a high risk of not repayment. So, I mean, but here's what I'm afraid of, is that we will see a repeat of this. That I don't know what the next set of innovations will be. My fear is that there will be innovations that will in part be designed to get around existing regulations, and the regulations won't catch up quickly enough. It'll depend, who's in power.
Well, you wrote about this in the book, that back when you were an adolescent, around the time of your bar mitzvah, you weren't sitting around worried about collateralized debt obligations or swaps and stuff. In other words, the financial services gets more and more sophisticated, but you're saying there's a mismatch between the speed at which we regulate.
Well, there has been. There doesn't have to be. I mean, what happened was this philosophy of deregulation set in. It wasn't that way in the 40s, 50s, 60s, but by the 90s, there was this deregulatory philosophy. And what I'm hoping is that coming out of the experience we had, it's going to be a while before people become that willing again to sit back. I think there are a lot of people now who are looking, who are asking, as you are. I mean, look, if we were being interviewed 40 years ago, people would be saying, well, what worries you about the financial system? The fact that you're asking that now is a sign, I think, of, yeah, we have learned the lesson. There is greater sophistication about the dangers.
Chris Dodd?
Yeah, two things. Well, the thing is less directly involved in specific financial institutions, but I think the debt issue domestically, both at the national level, the state level, the community level.
So national level, this is government borrowing, but also corporate debt, risky corporate debt.
I think it's a huge issue that's looming out there. I think it's regrettable in some ways. I mean, the fact that we're still 10 years later, not just a matter of history talking about this, but in fact, there are bills being introduced all the time to try and undo what Barney and I did. You've got things like fintech, you've got cybersecurity, you've got data issues. If I were chairing the committee today, I'd be looking, those are the issues that I think are rather on the cutting edge of the stability and soundness of our financial institutions. Instead of worrying about, the VOCA rule per se.
Or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is what you would argue.
Why aren't you looking at these real, and some of them are exciting, by the way. I'm not suggesting we ought to be opposed to them. I think fintech offers some unique opportunities. The Bitcoin issues and so, but why not just reject that out of hand? Seems to me smart, intelligent people ought to be looking at it to determine whether or not these are offering new opportunities for people to grow wealth, create jobs, and the like. So debt and these legitimate issues that are out there today that didn't exist 10 years ago.
And even here, though, there's some, and Chris is absolutely right on these new issues, fintech. I did notice that the Securities and Exchange Commission has stepped up, even under Trump, by the way, because that's another guy who's, I think, doing a good job as a regulator, unlike our fears that it would be totally cut back at the SEC. And they are now into this whole question of the ICOs, these coin offerings.
Yeah.
And the Securities and Exchange Commission has now ruled that if you are selling a new crypto coin, and the basic purpose is that not that it's going to be used as a currency, which is what they were originally claimed to be, but that it's a commodity that's going to increase in value, that's subject to SEC rules.
Yeah, that starts to sound like an investment.
Yeah, and so, but I was glad to see that this is an example of the SEC using the powers that it has between our bill and elsewhere to do that. And again, I think maybe 20 years from now, people will get less vigilant. But I do think there's a vigilance now, precisely that we better be on the lookout for innovation.
It's not just hypothetical. I think it was Goldman Sachs is now exploring this and actually dedicating resources and so forth to some of these new cutting edge areas, to their credit, in my view. That's what they ought to be doing. Smart institutions ought to be looking around the corner. What's coming next? How can we increase wealth and the like? So it's already happening out there, but that's where our attention ought to be on what's happening there, not trying to unravel a bill that has been accepted, that's working, the people are still having sort of a Pavlovian response
I
to.
will respond to it. If people ask, where are we on the bill? The best witness for how successful we were with financial reform is Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump brags all the time about how wonderfully the economy is performing. This is a terrific economy. This is such a great economy. Well, one of the essential pieces of a well-functioning economy is its financial system. And it simply would be impossible logically for the economy to be doing wonderfully if we had crippled the financial system. It cannot be that we are doing so well in terms of how the economy is functioning, but the banking system was broken. And in fact, what we have is a financial system that is working very well to do what it's supposed to do, which is to provide the money that is needed for productive activity, but has substantially diminished the chances of the kind of crisis we had before.
Has the president thanked you for all your hard work on this that allowed his
I don't
success?
know. I don't read his tweets as regularly as I should, so maybe there's one in there.
You know, I'm trying to figure out if what we've just been discussing is a success story or not. I was looking at some data. Social Science Research Council forecasts that the typical black family in America 25 or so years after the crisis, 2031, will have 40% fewer assets than had there
by the
been
way,
no Great Recession.
you're confusing something. Of course that's true, but you're confusing what we did in response to the crisis to the causes of the crisis.
Yeah.
Our bill didn't destroy people's houses. The practice of unregulated subprime loans destroyed the practice. So of course, if you're talking about are people in many cases worse off than they were before, yes, but the success story, we didn't claim that the bill undid all the social and economic crime. What we claimed, the bill was had one very specific, well, two things. The bailout had the purpose of trying to keep things from getting worse and becoming a general crash, and the bill had the purpose of trying to prevent these abuses in the future. Neither one of them had the capacity to undo what had been done before.
And you know, you have dedicated yourself, I think to some extent you have, you're focused on the horizon on this issue of economic inequality.
I tell you about, we did, more should have been done, as we both said, and try to deal with foreclosures. There's no question that was a serious.
That still drives you crazy, right?
It did. By the way, even after that, we had some leftover TARP money, and we managed to find $1 billion to be used to help people facing foreclosure who were unemployed. And to my great disappointment, Sean Donovan, the Secretary of HUD, refused to use it. They spent, under the Obama administration, they spent $400 million because of bureaucratic inefficiencies and left $600 million on the table. So that one, I acknowledge.
It was a whole different point. And that meeting on September 18th, I'll never forget, I forget it was, it might have been Hank Paulson, maybe it was Ben Bernanke, wanted to talk about the perception of housing foreclosures. And I remember just perception. I remember reacting to the word perception. There's like perception about it. It's real.
There are foreclosures,
Yeah.
people being turfed out of houses.
But their notion was that somehow this was sort of a myth.
And you know, the problem, well, these people weren't worthy, they over-borrowed, some of them did. But the problem with foreclosures was that foreclosures didn't just hurt the person foreclosed. If you have a house and you've worked hard to keep it up and 3 of the 8 houses on your block are subject to foreclosure, your property values go down. And maybe those people aren't taking care of their houses. So that one I copped to, and it was a problem. And frankly, I was a little disappointed in Obama. We banged at Paulson to say you should have used some of that 350, the first 350.
Of the TARP.
Yeah, for foreclosure relief. Finally, he gave in December after the election and said, okay, if Obama says okay, the president-elect, I'll ask for another 350 and I'll use some of that for foreclosure relief. And the Obama response was what Franklin Roosevelt had said with regard to Herbert Hoover, hey, I'm not the president yet. You have the authority to do it. You do it. Don't ask me to get involved. We only have one president at a time. And I did get very angry there. In fact, because Paulson said he would do it if Obama told him to, and Obama said he wouldn't do it because Paulson could do it without him, and we only had one president at a time. And I said that when Obama said we only had one president at a time, he was overstating the number of presidents who are currently available to help people. And but then, as Chris pointed out, they finally did.
How much did Obama love that, or how much did George W. Bush love that?
I was told they were both quite personally, directly unhappy. And but as Chris also noted, they finally did ask for a second amount, which we'd authorized, and that's where the auto bailout came from. They did get another $75 billion, but only for auto
The
bailout.
auto bailout's pretty popular.
It should have been. And we're proud of it.
Made a big difference.
Chris said it was because we structured the TARP that way. People who hate the TARP, love the auto bailout, ought to understand that the auto bailout, as Chris said, came out of the TARP.
I didn't ask this clearly enough. There seemed you, to a lesser extent, but certainly Geithner, Bernanke, Paulson talk about this frustration that TARP was misunderstood and remains misunderstood by the American people. But part of it is that you couldn't spook the American people too much, then you have a panic. If you're trying to explain why this is a clear and present danger. So there's this kind of tension.
Well, that's a good point. There's an analog. In 1947, Harry Truman's president, Republicans are in control of Congress, and he thinks he needs to spend hundreds of millions, then a lot of money, to stave off a communist takeover in Greece and Turkey. And he calls in the Republican Congress, the joint leadership of the Republicans in charge, and he said, I need this to send money to Greece and Turkey to stave off the communists. And one of the Republican Senate leaders, it might have been Senator Arthur Vandenberg, said, well, Mr. President, we can probably do that, but first you got to scare the hell out of the American people. And it's one thing to scare them about the communists, but you're right, it's another thing to scare them, because as Chris said, about confidence.
Well, you get a run on the bank.
And it was also, again, you're talking about people who are obviously come out of a world, tremendously talented, bright and so forth, but understanding the concept that while they were certainly correct in talking about the stability of the institutions, they had a very difficult time approaching this from the point of view of the consumer. It just wasn't part of their own, not part of their own language in a sense. I mean, coming from where they did. Not they didn't care about it, they did. But that was such an important point, how you described what we were doing. And invariably, it was always being described, and the media picking up on it, obviously, was providing financial assistance to these large financial institutions. And we didn't emphasize enough, in my view, when we had the opportunity to do so. Would have changed the perception. Wouldn't have changed what we did, but it would have changed the perception of what we did, which is true today, but hard to explain to people.
I mean, it's had lasting effects. We did a poll around the time of the last election, a scientific poll, and it found bipartisan agreement on something, which was that conservatives and liberals think the system is rigged on behalf of someone else. They slightly disagree about who it's rigged in favor of, rich people, politicians, corporations, but the perception that the system doesn't look out for the little guy is defining our politics now.
No question, and I will go back to the question before. The underlying reality there is that, in fact, the way the capitalism has worked in America in the past 30 years, they're right. Growth has produced increased inequality, and there has not been a fair sharing. The crisis did help transform that into a general perception, into a belief that it wasn't simply that that was happening, but that the elite wanted it to happen, that it was not just a fact, but a conscious choice. So I agree that that was the case. The other problem we have, though, but this is a constant problem in public policy, the economists have a technical term called the counterfactual. If you are an economist and you are modeling a policy, you talk about the policy, and then you have what's called the counterfactual. That is, you model what would have happened if you hadn't followed this policy. Because very often what you were talking about is not an ideal, but the best possible deal. And the counterfactual is what economists use to justify policy A because it would have been better than policy B. There's no counterfactual in the real world. We couldn't say, you know what, let's show people. Let's have a TARP, and then let's have a universe in which there is no TARP. And when people see how much
Do a
worse
controlled experiment.
Right, when people see how much worse there was without a TARP, they'll love the TARP.
Yeah.
But you can't do that.
Maybe, because they'll argue for eons to come. And there's certainly a constituency that feels we should have done nothing with TARP. We should have let the market work. It would have gotten rid of things and so on. And they'll maintain that position forever. We did not have the luxury of gambling at that particular point.
Yeah, it goes back to my my undying principle of decision making in government, and it was articulated by Henny Youngman, the stand-up comedian of the 50s and 60s. And back then, they used to make a lot of jokes about wives, and he's the shortest joke ever. Take my wife, please. But he had one joke that was also quite profound. How's your wife compared to what? That is.
How's your TARP? How's your Dodd-Frank compared to what?
Yeah. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Ben Bernanke translated that into not having a counterfactual, but he and Henny Youngman have the same perception.
So, Chris Dodd, Barney Frank, you're linked forever, the two of you, in history. The Dodd-Frank legislation.
Yeah, can I say this? And I'm very proud of this. One of the things that plagues Congress, and over and above the real problems, are jealousies and turf battles. There has been
Senate versus House, House versus Senate, yeah.
Senate versus House, and then within jurisdictions, this committee versus that committee. And the late Hale Boggs, one of the great legislators of all time, a congressman, told his daughter, Cokie Roberts, one time when she said something about the Republicans being the enemy, he said, no, as a House member, the Republicans are the opposition. The Senate is the enemy. And I am very proud of Chris and I working from 2008 in the toughest time in American history, and we had perfect cooperation.
Still friends.
And perfect cooperation, no jealousies, and our staffs deserve a lot of credit for that. There's often staff backbiting. Our staffs work together as one thing. And then, by the way, one of the things they don't have anymore, we had a 2-week House-Senate conference conducted on C-SPAN, literally for 2 weeks, in which we talked about everything we were doing. Obviously, there were some private conversations, but not a single decision was ratified except by a vote in public. And in fact, the process of Senate House conferences had so fallen out of favor. Some people had never been to one, didn't know how they worked.
Haven't been any sense either, by the way.
No.
You know, the thing, just to underscore, Barney knows this too, at about 4:30 in the morning, it was Congressman Kanjorski from Pennsylvania who made the motion to call this the Frank Dodd bill. And of course, Barney comes up with this great line, I think it's one person. There was only a voice vote, but I yelled out no. And I say this now, obviously I'm very proud to be associated with this and with Barney. But there's so many people who are involved in this. And Barney's mentioned staff. It's interesting with financial services, whether it's Glass-Steagall, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, Sarbanes-Oxley. It's one area of the law where we put names on bills. But both of us would tell you that this never would have happened without some incredible support of people across and both parties back and forth. And so it does that. I'll tell you two other things kind of interesting to make Barney's point. I was in India and meeting with the leadership of their central bank that wanted to talk about Dodd-Frank, and the woman who was asking the questions, asking great questions, just terrific questions. I said, how do you know so much about the bill? Oh, she said, I watched it on C-SPAN here in New Delhi.
She saw the.
And then in China, I was asked to come by and meet with the central bank. Was happy to do that. They want to talk about Dodd-Frank. I walked in, and they gave me a direct translation of Dodd-Frank in Mandarin. And
I have one. He gave
one to Barney. Our
like
opponents think the original draft was in Mandarin.
That's
interesting.
By the way, there's still I'll be going to France later. We were the pioneers. The legislation we did it first. This kind of regulation, and it has been widely
it's had
followed.
Global effects.
Yeah, widely followed, and it gave our people. To some people, it enhanced the kind of competitive advantage because Chris alluded to this before. People don't want to put their money somewhere if they think it's going to disappear into some black hole. And one of the things that our bill does, a law, legal law, not ours, the law, it gives people who are going to invest in America a very high degree of confidence that they may make a misjudgment, they may misread the trends, but there'll be no loss of money because of hanky-panky.
I just talked to a recent regulator of an international operation that deals with financial services and said, today your banks are the envy of the world. Compared to European banks and elsewhere, there's no comparison whatsoever. The strength of our banks, their stability is just beyond comparison to anyone else around the world.
Yet they kvetch, as my grandmother would say.
Yes,
they say that what you created was so complicated.
Well, they didn't like the capital. I mean, that was the first of all, capital standards.
The reserves, the buffers.
And then Jamie Dimon complained at one point that he had to deal with so many regulators, and my answer was, well, if you don't want to deal with so many regulators, don't be in so many different lines of business. We didn't create the complications, they did. J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of America, these are Goldman Sachs, these are very complex entities. And part of the problem was before we had to get into this, they were trying to regulate very complex, intricate entities with very simple rules, and it didn't work.
All right, but Dodd-Frank, one of the world's legendary duos now. What do you like? I was trying to come up with it. The Simon and Garfunkel of regulation. I know. The Thomas Jefferson and John Adams of financial regulation.
Well, that's better than Hamilton and Jefferson.
But we didn't, and we didn't have our period of
falling out?
Of anger. Yeah, no, I mean, and I was really happy about it because the dangers of well, I will take. I'm happy with this. I had an easier job because I didn't have the 60 vote problem. Although Chris had an easier job in the TARP because there were more cooperative Republicans. But, and this is, again, the last point, let's make, maybe the last point. But we're talking now about beginning with the TARP at a comparable period to today. This is just before a presidential election. And we Democrats are working fully to help out and save the bacon of the Bush administration. And Chris then tries to carry this over when we're doing the legislation, and initially makes some very real efforts to work with Republicans, and then the word comes down from the Republican leadership. And so in the end, it was a totally partisan process. And people say, whatever happened to bipartisanship? Very simple. Barack Obama got elected, and the cooperation we Democrats had given to George Bush totally disappeared, and it became just unrelenting opposition to everything.
I'll tell you two anecdotes that will make the point that Barney's just done so. When Ted Kennedy got very sick, he asked me to take over the committee and deal with the Affordable Care Act. The markup on the Labor Committee, which I ran, was the longest single markup in the history of that committee since 1868. On the Banking Committee, 401 amendments were filed on the Friday before the markup of the bill. On Sunday, I get a call from my friend Richard Shelby. I was in New York, and he announced to me over the phone.
The senior Republican.
Senior Republican.
He tells me on the phone, they're not going to offer any amendments in the committee markup of the bill. That committee markup lasted 19 minutes, the shortest markup in the history of the Banking Committee. Now, we had 60 amendments we debated on the floor of the Senate, but there was not a single amendment offered by a Republican in the markup of the legislation.
They wouldn't vote for it, and because they just wanted to.
So there was no effort. Despite Bob Corker and a few others, I had no cooperation to try and get anything at all, which is my inclination on this stuff.
Contrast, we were doing things that we know were going to be politically damaging to us because we felt the country needed it. And then Barack Obama becomes president, Mitch McConnell announces that all they want to do is make sure he doesn't get reelected. And I think that's, people talk about, a plague on both the houses from the standpoint of partisanship. No, I think the record is very clear. We have reacted since, but there was a high point of bipartisan cooperation in the Congress between Democratic leadership and George Bush, and then an absolute total disappearance of that once Barack Obama.
But that has relevance if another financial crisis is visited upon us. In other words, the rancor that is now magnitudes larger now than it was then. I mean, they're going to have to work together if there's a disaster.
And there are
questions about that.
Mike Crapo in the Senate and now the chairman of the Banking Committee, I disagreed as Barney did with the recent bill, but not viciously. I mean, there were only a couple of provisions. Yeah. But he's doing a very good job as chairman of that committee and working with Democrats. Ended up with a bipartisan bill when they went forward on it. Kept us informed, by the way. I saw a draft of this thing before they voted on it, so they asked our opinion, even though we're longer in Congress. So I've got a little more, and now in the House, I think there's some better opportunities.
But here's the deal: the Senate Democrats and Republicans who did this fairly small change, the fear a lot of people had was, as you said, thin edge of the wedge. When the bill went over to the House, the Republicans in the House said, "Okay, the smaller banks want this. We're going to hold it hostage and make the Democrats in the Senate give in to a much broader weakening of Dodd-Frank." And to the Democrats in the Senate who voted this credit, they said, this was our deal. And Senator Crapo, the Republican, said to the Republicans in the House, no, I made a deal with these people, and I'm sticking with it. Yeah. And that was probably the only genuinely bipartisan thing done, except for veterans, which is always easily done bipartisan, was that, and it was them saying, okay, we're going to take care of these smaller banks, but that's going to be it.
Yeah.
Barney Frank represented Massachusetts in the House for 32 years. Chris Dodd represented Connecticut in the Senate for almost the same stretch after many years in the House. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.